Hello there, sword friends. I am going to try and answer a question that popped up into my mind. You see, not too long ago, I was perusing the forums, as I often do, and I happened to see a secondhand Albion first generation sword. And what came into my mind was a question that I had when I started looking at swords, and what's the difference between a first generation Albion sword versus what you might buy that isn't a first generation or something of that extent. And so I happen to have right now an Albion Acre, I think is how you pronounce it. I'm not good at reading. Also, the Albion Mercenary that I've done a review on some time ago. So I can, well, they're not the same type of typology in terms of sword. They are at least from the same maker at different points in time. And there are some points that I can make about the contrast between the build quality between the pair of them. Now, if I'm just summing things up, being quick about it, the original generation is not as good as the later generations. They have evolved in their craftsmanship and their ability and their quality attention. I don't know exactly what you want to call it. I'm not a swordsmith, but there are details that seem to be much finer and more refined in the newer swords versus the older ones. From my understanding, the original Albion first generation sword sold for under $500. And so you can kind of keep that was many years ago, though. So I don't really know. But when they come up for sale, I will show you the difference between them, and then I have a really shitty sword around that I can contrast for you as well, so that you can kind of see the difference even between a first generation Albion sword and what a version of bad would be. They're still very, very good swords, and so while some pieces have been refined over time, and I'll try to explain my perception between the two examples that I have, which are certainly not representative of every sword that Albion makes today and every sword that they have made in their first generation, but it's at least a general what to expect if you happen to see one pop up on the secondhand market. Without further ado, I have both the swords in my hand. What I'm going to share with you is what I observe from the tips. Now, I get it. I know that they are different styles of swords, and I will also note that I am not as familiar with what this geometry should look like versus this geometry. So I'm going to have to kind of call it like I see it, and maybe I'm off, and if I am, throw that in the commentary below. Now, what I do see between the Acre and the Mercenary here, at least in terms of build quality, is that they both do have a center ridge line, at least towards the top third of the blade. And what I see in the Acre is that that center ridge line kind of muddles a little bit. It's not as crisp and clean throughout. Maybe it's not supposed to be, but the fact that it's there and is not as crisp as this, or at least identifiable, defined, and staying true and whatnot all the way through the sword, that's one thing that I am noticing as a difference. There is a center ridge line, it is there, but it's not as crisp and easy to identify as it is on this sword at any point. The other things I'll note is just from a cross-section side, they both seem to be pretty good. There's not really a difference geometry-wise per se, at least in terms of like how well they got the cross-section side, and both of them feel like very good swords in my hand, but that center ridge line tapers off. If I go to the fuller, and the Mercenary not having a fuller, I can't really compare, but what I do see is that it kind of goes off at a little bit of an angle. It's imperfect. I mean, it's not the worst example. I have a terrible example here I can show you that is awful and different on both sides and really goes off at a bad direction. But this one is still not perfect, uneven. It looks like the CNC, I don't know if the mill came off at an angle. I'm not 100% sure. The fuller is at a higher polish level than the rest of the sword. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but the transition, the end of the fuller, is really what I'm talking about, and it doesn't look great. Noticeable that it goes off at an end if you're really looking at it, but if you don't really look at it, you don't really notice it. They do end at about the same spot. Maybe you can see that, but they don't. They go off at kind of an angle and look a little like they didn't terminate as well as they could have. The crossguard. Now, in terms of construction, both of them are very, very good. Okay, there's nothing that rattles, nothing that feels bad. But the crossguard, if I look at the hole in the crossguard, and I'll show you again an example of bad, but the contrast between the Acre, it looks like it was milled out and with a very clean tolerance for a gap. But there is a gap there, It's clean, it looks nice, it's not overly pronounced, it's not bad, but there is a gap. And on the Mercenary, there is not. It is tightly fit, kind of like compression fit all the way in there. That would keep, water potentially from getting in. There's very small openings on the Mercenary, but overall, very, very tight versus has a small gap. However, even though the Acre has some minor gap, don't misconstrue that for abnormal or terrible in the reproduction market. Now, I'm going to show you a hyperbolistic version of bad, but this is really an example of what bad is. And by contrast, even though the Acre has a gap, it's still pretty damn good. And the Albion Mercenary having no gap is fucking great. And then the furniture-wise, it's hard to compare. I don't know the way that they're supposed to look in terms of fittings and whatnot and so forth. They're different swords, but they seem relatively comparative. This is very simple with no real lines. This tries to have a center ridge that kind of goes off in one side. You can see that it's kind of flat, and then on this side it's kind of crisp. So I'm not sure exactly the way it's supposed to be, but this side has a nice clean center ridge, and this side looks a little bit muddled. On the Mercenary, I see pretty even transitions throughout. There's no center crisp line or anything like that, and the pommel is very even. There's nothing that really stands out to me as eye-catchingly off, nor does it on this one in terms of the pommel. But fittings wise, the Mercenary is plain Jane. There's no center ridge lines for me to compare, but there's nothing that stands out as broken either. The grips are where we kind of see some differences. Now the Acre has just kind of a thin little, it fits in my hand really easy. I have big giant sausage hands, but this feels small, but it's still easy to grip. But it's just one shape. It's oval in general, but it doesn't have any taper, as where you can see the Mercenary gets real thin towards the top, bulges out in the center, and then kind of tapers down again. So it fits my hand really well, but there's some curvature and contrast in there, which presumably is supposed to be there. Also, if I look at the wire wrap, there's a little bit of jutting out in terms of how the lacquer or whatever is on the surface of the handle. It's very, very even, and here there's just minor imperfections. I would call them character granting almost, but you can see that it's less straight in terms of this kind of cord wrap, and some bits jut out in here. Anyway, this is just done to a higher level. That's really the contrast that I see between them. There's been a marked improvement as time goes on, but that's just what you would hope for in the evolution of any sword maker. To contrast, though, I'm not painting the Acre in a very positive light or the early work. Just to compare, this is an example of bad. So you get an idea that the sword is still a very good sword. It's still a very good grip, just that they've gotten better over time. It's certainly not bad. This is what bad looks like. The difference in the peen work. No, maybe not. Okay. Well, the Mercenary has a very nice peen. It's almost tough to make out exactly if it's there or not, and it is, but it's buffed down to a pretty high level. The Acre has a noticeable peen. I don't know if this is an aesthetic choice, but you can see that it's there. It's clean. It's nice, but it's not completely vanished into the sword. Contrasting the lines. Now, when I say the lines, I'm a Japanese sword guy. This is no surprise to anyone that really watches my channel. But what I look at pretty often is the flats of the blade. And what I like to see is a glass smooth surface. Everything, when I say that, I mean I don't want these flats to wiggle around. Okay? Now that's hard to do from a construction standpoint. It shows that you have a very steady hand while you're grinding and that you're paying attention while you're polishing. And it's something I notice as a level of craftsmanship. Now, the Albion swords are not perfect. And frankly, I don't know that anyone else in the European sword community, I don't know if that's a detail that people really care as much about aesthetically. It doesn't seem to be something that's given as much attention to or put in as much priority, but I don't really know. It is something that I look at, though. And what I'll say is, while the Albions are not perfect, there's some ripple and wiggle in this that I would say is, bothers me. But the older version, the Arc, Acre has more ripple and wiggle than the Mercenary does. And this one overall has a cleaner, smoother geometry in terms of the flats being clean than the Acre does. But that said, I don't really want to call the Acre bad because I have an example of bad for you. And a lot of the European swords that I see from Windlass or Dark Sword Armory or some of the less expensive brands really just, it looks like a stone thrown into a pond or something like that. There's so much wiggle and ripple all around the surface of the steel. Again, I don't know if people really care a lot about that, but very frequently, swords are not as clean as this. This is a very good example in the European style swords. I haven't had as many Hanwei pieces in the European realm or custom pieces, so I can't really speak to the level of what you would expect to get from a custom sword maker, but I can say that the Albions that I've seen are at least cleaner. They're not perfect, but they're cleaner, and they are a mass-produced sword, so I don't know that I necessarily expect them to be glass smooth or perfect, but at the same time, a point that I noted that I hope you find useful. Anyway, I hope that those points help you understand maybe some of what to expect in terms of the difference between a first-generation sword that you might see on the market secondhand and what you would get, presumably, with a later version from Albion. Again, don't think that this is representative of every first-generation sword or every sword made after the first generation. I have two very limited examples that I got secondhand. So keep that in your mind as you compare, but if you are thinking about some of the generic quality differences, it seems like a softer touch to some of the details in terms of the center ridge lines and how crisp they are. Some of the planes might be slightly more ripply. There's going to be less attention to the grip in terms of its shape and overall lacquer work. I'm not sure exactly if it's lacquer on there, but the coating that's put on the grip, and that's really kind of what you can expect. Also, the guard may have a smaller gap in it, but if you compare that, still a lot of these secondhand Albion swords that are up, including the one that I showed just a little bit earlier, available on SBG at the moment, are still a lot better than many of the other European swords that I've seen available today. Even though the details may not be as crisp as their current versions, they're still pretty damn good compared to what's out there. And considering how old they are, it shows the evolution of Albion, but also there's been an evolution in price too. So, keep that in mind as you consider, but still don't think that they're garbage. They're still pretty darn good swords. I hope that has helped you, and thanks for listening to me rant and ramble. If you have any other information, again, I have a lot less knowledge as it relates to European swords and a lot less examples or history with examples to draw from. So if there's anything else that you think is worth noting between them, throw it in the commentary below. If you think I missed anything, let me know. And as always, cheers and thanks for watching. Okay. Oh, less squeaky chair. WD-40. Solving chair problems for, well, at least a couple minutes. Coffee this time, not scotch. It's too early, even for me. I really ramble on so much. I'm not doing a very good job of explaining this. There's a lot of ums and buts and ugh. So I'm gonna just start over.